Thank you, Derval, for that introduction, and thank you to Joe for taking a gamble on a relative unknown and inviting me here today. I'm not entirely thankful for having to follow the expert on sectarianism that is Duncan Morrow, but I will give it a shot anyway. So 21 years after the Good Friday Agreement, Northern Ireland is still not a society at peace with itself. The constitutional question still defines our politics, and by and large, communities still live separately, with little meaningful integration. Although recent elections have suggested a move towards the middle ground, most notably with the so-called alliance surge, the smaller parties still remain a long way off the big two, and Sinn Féin and the DUP continue to dominate the political landscape for the best part of this century, as voters continue to prioritise their constitutional preference at the ballot box. And it should be added that there's absolutely nothing wrong with being nationalist or unionist, but we do need to find a way of expressing these identities that doesn't set them against each other, nor does it prioritise them above everything else. This challenge has been compounded by the existential crisis that Brexit presents for identity politics, for UK-Irish relations, and to the UK itself. Add to the mix the absence of an executive and an assembly, and it's fair to say that these are very uncertain times for all on these islands. For Northern Ireland in particular, this new fault line could undermine any progress that has been made towards a more inclusive society, and comes at a time when a new generation enjoyed opportunities that separated them from a history that was not of their making. Indeed, it's ironic that the European Union, one of the institutions that has been part of the healing process in Northern Ireland through various peace programmes, is now one of the factors driving a wedge through community relations. As someone born in 1985, my generation didn't really experience the troubles firsthand. However, we have inherited its legacy in the form of sectarianism. And the extent of the normalisation of this is such that it's become an acceptable characteristic of public policy, legitimised through policies that keep us apart. And we need to look no further than our education system for evidence of this. In my role as a political consultant and as a former political advisor, I'm a believer in the effectiveness of policy and legislation in creating the conditions required for meaningful change. We talk about how sectarianism has become institutionalised, but I believe that it's the very institutions which are key to unlocking this. Whilst fixes have been applied to the political challenges that have arisen since the Good Friday Agreement, such as those contained in the St Andrews and in the Stormont House agreements, these have been responses to particular moments of crises. This stop-start approach to governing gives short-term cover, which sustains us until the next crisis, but ultimately it fails to get to the root of the problem. In this paper, I'm going to make a few recommendations that I believe could enable a sustainable and more enduring government, and which will put the structures and systems in place to help build a more inclusive society. Whilst many of my proposals are nothing new, their effectiveness is conditional upon delivering these parallel changes both at government and at policy level, in root and branch reform that remains true to the agreed vision contained in the Good Friday Agreement. So 3 main areas I'm going to talk about are the review and reform of the structures of government, a programme for government underpinned by legislation, and a suite of rights-based legislation. The first one is the review and reform of the structures of government. From the origins of James Craig's Protestant Parliament for a Protestant people to a consociationalist government with transformative equality legislation, we have come a long way in our 100 years. However, in spite of progress, institutional barriers still remain which prevent the next phase of our political journey, and we're feeling the effects of them right now. Mark Durkan famously referred to the ugly scaffolding of the Good Friday Agreement in describing some of the necessary features installed to safeguard against abuses. And 11 years since he coined this phrase, and indeed as one of the architects of the agreement, they still remain. One of these features is the rather crude requirement for MLAs to designate as nationalist, unionist or other on the first day they arrive at the Assembly. Initially a mechanism to protect minorities, it now serves to enforce divisions in the very institution that was brought to bring people together. And this perfectly distills the crux of the problem. Our institutions were designed to promote equality, but not integration. The outworkings of this process are also manifest in cross-community voting and the petition of concern, another tool which sought to protect against discrimination, but we all know how that's gone. The executive suffers a similar challenge on this front. As a power-sharing model, it is a multi-party government with departments allocated to each party using the d'Hondt system on the basis of vote share. For the smaller parties, there's little incentive in this model, as they're often lumped with the departments with minimal power and minimal budget, bound by the shortcomings of the bigger parties when things go wrong, but loath or limited to celebrate in the success of a collective of which they're only bit players. So there was a positive development in the introduction of an Opposition Act, which was brought about by former MLA John McAllister, and it gave the SDLP and the UUP at this time, as they had the numbers, the opportunity to remove themselves from the executive and to mount a challenge function to the DUP and to Sinn Féin. And it was also something that was agreed in St Andrews. However, the Act didn't afford resources, either parliamentary or financial, to enable opposition parties to effectively challenge the muscle of big government departments. If we are to enable an opposition to properly function, there must be support for parties who elect to fulfil this role, as the current Act is just not equipped to deliver on its intent. If we consider other structural reforms which have taken place, sometimes it looks like we have made no progress at all, but we just look to the fact that we have reduced our bureaucracy. MLAs have been reduced from 108 to 90, our government departments from 12 to 9, the review of public administration reduced our councils from 26 to 11. So it's clear that the system is evolving and that there is an appetite for change. We have now outgrown the original structures, which were designed to suit the challenges of a society emerging from conflict, but which are now serving to limit its potential. Therefore, we need to ensure that any future arrangements are equipped not only to deal with and withstand these challenges, but to resolve them. The Assembly and Executive Review Committee have undertaken a range of reviews into different aspects of the Northern Ireland Act. However, I think there are two shortcomings with this piece of work. The first is that the review has looked at individual strands and clauses within the Northern Ireland Act and not as a whole. And the second is that this review is carried out by MLAs, who obviously have a very vested interest in the outworkings of it. One solution to this would be to mandate an external body, such as a Citizens' Assembly, with the task of review and reform of the Northern Ireland Act. Composed of a representative sample of society who are selected at random and provided with the facts and different arguments, as any statutory committee in the Assembly would be, this Assembly would be free of the burden of political allegiance demanded of our elected representatives that sometimes tints their decision-making process. Armed with similar powers that you might expect in a public inquiry and critically placed on a legal footing, this would ensure that the required resources are available to undertake this hugely important task. The findings could be put to a referendum, putting public ownership of our institutions firmly back with the people that they were established to represent, and indeed would constitute a follow-up from the original referendum in 1998. One of the big problems with this is no one's lobbying for it. We are expecting our MLAs to reform a system that suits their needs, and we've become complacent as citizens and individuals ourselves. Moving on to the programme for government, we've moved towards an outcomes-based programme for government, and this shows further signs that our government is evolving, even though we don't have one at the minute. Although it's still in draft form due to the fact that the executive never signed off before collapsing, it moved away from the traditional output model, which enabled and permitted a silos approach, and replaced it with 12 simple outcomes which demand cross-departmental working to achieve their ends. A concept that's promoted by the Carnegie UK Trust, the draft programme for government put well-being at the heart of everything it tried to achieve. And using the outcomes model, it seeks to deliver generational change, not change for 4 years or for the electoral term, but for change that would affect us across our lifetimes. This has the potential to develop and establish a more long-term vision for Northern Ireland, and it's based on a clear, unambiguous vision. It's improving the well-being of citizens, taking the politics out of things. The key to making it work is underpinning it with legislation. It's not something the executive are considering. And in the same way as the Good Friday Agreement insisted on ugly scaffolding as conditions for governance around areas such as protecting minorities, the constitutional settlement and power sharing, there is learning that should be deployed to developing an agreed framework that can deliver long-term generational change, no matter who the government of the day is. This has been done in Scotland through the Community Empowerment Act and in Wales through the Future Generations Act, and they both put well-being at the centre of what they seek to achieve. And its relevance extends beyond trying to deal with the sectarianism, and it's a sign of a responsible government acting to ensure that its delivery agents are equipped to deliver on its policy intent. With the inclusion of an outcome that states, "We are a shared, welcoming and confident society that respects diversity," I know we don't really recognise that one at the minute, there is a duty incumbent on all departments to work towards achieving this. But my point is that this needs enshrined as a legal duty. This would require arm's-length bodies and government agencies to deliver on the outcomes approach. as present legislation sets out very different priorities for them, and they're accountable to sponsoring departments. So legislation needs to reflect this, both at the programme for government level as well as in its delivery agents. Goodwill and platitudes will not deliver cultural and generational change that's required to radically transform how our government policy is made. We must also make provision for empowering and incentivising the community and voluntary sector, who play a key role in connecting government with its citizens and who have delivered an increasing number of services in recent years. Take, for example, Comhaltas Cultúrtha Éireann, who I'm delighted are here today, who I've worked with and who are a grassroots membership-led organisation promoting Irish culture and music. They developed a partnership with the Royal Scottish Pipes and Drums Association based on their love of music and traditions, and this has led to some fantastic work on the ground. This is an example of the sort of organic community-level engagement that is impactful and effective, and where the outcome is bigger than the sum of its parts. But current funding models do not have the flexibility to reward this approach to reflect its numerous benefits. And whilst there have been some changes in how it's awarded, or how funding is awarded, there is still a journey to go if it's to deliver on the ambitions programme for government. But there's no point in doing one without the other. New Zealand recently introduced its first wellbeing budget, which aligns growth to outcomes and to people's lives. And whilst we're probably quite a while off delivering something as radical as this, these are the sort of opportunities that our politicians should be considering to enable a complete paradigm shift. And as a small region, with duplication of services to the tune of about £1 billion, thanks to our need for separate but equal facilities, as well as our very limited financial levers, perhaps this is the sort of opportunity that could be transformative. Moving on to my third area, which is rights-based legislation. So with the political and government frameworks underpinned by legislation and change, my last recommendation is to layer this with a Bill of Rights to provide a minimum standard or a baseline for citizens, as well as to kick-start the behavioural change that is required to treat the malaise that is sectarianism. This is outstanding from the Good Friday Agreement, and it's something that has been campaigned for extensively by organisations including the Human Rights Commission, who have been endowed with statutory instruction and who have conducted extensive engagement on this matter. And I think it's important to make mention of our robust Section 75 legislation, which put equality of opportunity and good relations at the heart of policy making, laying the foundations necessary for locking down equality across the community. But the next step is a suite of legislation that builds on the equalities that are now embedded and that actively promotes integration, which is the missing part. Sceptics might question the power of legislation that I keep banging on about in changing hearts and minds. But I would point to something very simple, like the plastic bag levy in Northern Ireland, as testament to a simple, effective and radical impact that can change behaviour and can address major long-term policy challenges. In this instance, reducing our use in plastic bags. The levy has generated £19 million since it was brought in 2013, and this money has been used to protect and enhance the environment, and has taken around 1 billion plastic bags out of our system. But critically, it's made us change the way we use plastic bags, or use less of them. And the point is that this legislation, albeit incentive or disincentive based, has changed behaviour at a grassroots level, the same thing we need to do in order to combat sectarianism, in a very short space of time. And this approach really merits consideration. I'm not likening sectarianism to plastic bags, but there's a model there. In terms of social change, we need only look at the game-changing impact which equal marriage legislation has had here in the Republic, and which has been dealt with what had been a very politically charged issue. Whilst it has transformed the lives of those who have been able to invoke the legislation and get married, the heavens have not fallen in, as many detractors had warned against. And so one might consider that once rights are enshrined in law, they become less politically contentious, and it's a settled issue. And key to unlocking the equal marriage issue was, again, a citizens' assembly. They played a very big role in broadening the conversation, taking the decision away from the politicians and giving more power to the voice of ordinary citizens. Whilst its composition mirrored that of society, freedom from political labels and party structures enabled a much more authentic decision-making process, which gave participants space to think and critically to change their minds, based on evidence and facts and not in politics. This model can be used not only in the respect of institutional reform, as I discussed earlier, but could help unlock controversial issues that have been gridlocked and that our politicians simply can't deal with. However, interestingly, in the past few weeks, we have seen the effect of putting these decisions in another place with the Northern Ireland Executive Formation Bill. I'm sure you'll be aware that a few rogue amendments have meant that a few MPs have been able to put equal marriage, abortion, victims' pensions onto the back of a piece of legislation that was supposed to deal with the date of an election. The interesting piece about this is the political fallout, where we see the DUP and Sinn Féin essentially swap places, whereby Sinn Féin, the abstentionist party, have welcomed the political interference from Westminster, whilst the DUP have objected to it due to the issues that it deals with. And whilst it remains to be seen how this will play out long term, it may be the case that even the DUP privately are relieved to have these controversial issues removed from their in-tray. A recent press release from South Belfast MLA Christopher Stalford had talked about the fact that they don't have the numbers to block, equal marriage. So the DUP may actually have pulled the ultimate political manoeuvre here, having privately accepted that equal marriage would come about as a result of them not having the necessary numbers, but ensuring that Sinn Féin couldn't take credit for it. So I'm going to finish in a minute. Nearly on. So with the current indirect direct rule that is in place, ultimately unsustainable due to the legal clause that will require the Secretary of State to call an election in January, if not October, as well as a judicial review hanging over her head, or his head, whoever that next person may be, from victims and survivors of institutional abuse. The learning from this could stand a citizens' assembly model in good stead. Indeed, last year, Stratagem worked on the first ever pilot of a citizens' assembly in Northern Ireland, and so preliminary political engagement has already been undertaken. There hasn't been unanimous support for it at this stage, but what I would say is that neither was there support for opposition in the early days, so we just need to continue to make the arguments and reflect them better in how we do that. And there's a potential to change minds by convincing politicians of the valuable role it could help them as legislators. But in any event, key to making this effective is ensuring that, as the case in the Republic is, it's put on a statutory footing, given the authority it requires to deliver its objective. In conclusion, I started out by talking about how we often refer to sectarianism as being institutionalised, and I return to the point that it is the very institutions that can unlock the problem through affirmative action and deliberate changes to our structures and systems. In order to accompany these changes, we need to take a very different approach to how we develop policy, and the package of measures which I propose should be taken as a whole, rather than as optional add-ons. Without a whole systems approach to reform, which includes policy and government, we deny ourselves the best opportunity of properly dealing with the problem. And experience to date in addressing sectarianism shows that it is not going anywhere fast. So my challenge to politicians in doing this is not to take the quid pro quo approach that has characterised the St Andrews Agreement and all those that have followed subsequently, but to agree a platform that can sustain the turbulence of governing and that accommodates but doesn't prioritise our constitutional positions in areas that serve to perpetuate sectarian attitudes. This needs legislation, and it needs political bravery and ambition. But perhaps the new world order emerging around us presents the opportunity and, more importantly, the need to do things differently. Thank you.